First of all, welcome to this evening of the Vidal Sassoon Center. As you all know, the subject of tonight is a very vast, important topic: Judaism, Christianity, and the roots of European culture. As Professor Marga, our distinguished guest, told me just before we entered, in Europe, this is eine brennende Frage, a burning question. But also for us in Israel, it's a matter of some importance, not only historical, but I would say in a very contemporary and actual way. I would just make a few brief comments on the subject, introduce our distinguished guest. After he has concluded his remarks, we are fortunate to have Professor Moshe Idel, who has kindly agreed to respond, and I will introduce him. And he will then say what he has to say in response. And then we will also have some additional remarks and a discussion. I think everybody in this room is aware of the fact that there's been a huge transformation in Christian attitudes since the Shoah towards Jews and Judaism. We may discuss or debate how extensive, how deep that change is, but it is undeniable. And in many respects, I think that such a topic, like the one we'll be discussing this evening, would not have been possible, sad and perhaps even tragic as it is to think about that, would not have been possible in an earlier era, before the disasters and the catastrophe that happened to the Jewish people and which also overtook Europe itself. There were precursors, there were pioneers of what is now called the Jewish-Christian dialogue, but they were minority voices, important though their contribution was. I'm sure that we will, in the course of this evening, discuss also what we mean by such broad and sweeping terms as Judaism and Christianity. Obviously, the Christian world is not a monolithic entity any more than Judaism itself is. We all know that there was a schism between the Western and the Eastern Christian world, at least more than 1,000 years ago, between the Catholics and the Protestants some 500 years ago, not to speak about other divisions that exist. Nevertheless, in a broader sense, we all use these terms, and they are indispensable to us. I was recently in France, and not for the first time, I was struck, particularly because I was in a city where the Middle Ages has left their imprint in the south of France, struck by that medieval dualism or dichotomy between Judaism and Christianity, which is illustrated in many of the cathedrals of Europe as a whole, and in France in particular. Perhaps the most spectacular example is not in the south, but in Strasbourg, where you have the dichotomy of ecclesia and synagoga. And essentially, the synagogue, in contrast to the radiant brightness and looking to the future of the figure of the church representing the church, the synagogue is downcast and blinded or blindfold. So you do not see the face, so to speak, figuratively, of Judaism. And this was a traditional view that was held until very recently, until even perhaps the middle of the 20th century, that in some sense Judaism had been blind to the truth, the absolute truth of Christianity. And this is a classic dichotomy. But if you think about it, the blindfold is also the blindness not of Judaism so much, but of the Christian gaze, which refused to recognize in the message of Judaism, despite its closeness and its essentially formative character for the Christian identity, it refused to recognize it. So it placed the blindfold on the synagogue. And I think that's one of the things that has changed in Europe. The recognition is there. It may be grudging, it may be difficult at times. None of the theological and other issues are going to disappear, and they have not disappeared. Nevertheless, the willingness to recognize the Jewish roots of Christianity, the degree to which the Christian message, Christian identity itself, doesn't really have an anchorage without that recognition, and the need for Europe also to find its own roots, spiritual, historical, moral, and so on. I think all these things have contributed, and I'm sure Professor Marga will enlighten us in what ways, and in terms of the current debate, in what ways this is true. So even though, as a center, the Vidal Sassoon Center specializes in, and our mandate is more connected with the history and the contemporary actuality of anti-Semitism, we need sometimes to broaden our own horizons to see the other side of the picture. There's no need to elaborate here on the long, painful, nightmarish, in many ways, history of Christian anti-Semitism. We've done that on other occasions. We want to take a different look at that relationship today. And let me now say a few words about Professor Marga, who is the rector of the University of Babeș-Bolyai in Cluj-Napoca, and he's held that position since the 1990s, early 1990s. He's also been the Minister of National Education in Romania in the past, and engaged in a very extensive program of reform of the educational system in directions which I think probably here in Israel we might possibly be able to learn from, given the rather dire state of the educational scene at the moment, not just at this university but at all Israeli universities. He's a professor of contemporary philosophy and general logic. Among the themes, just to show you how polyvalent Andrei Marga is, the philosophy of European unification, a special interest in multiculturalism, the functioning of a multicultural university, which has been one of the most important reforms and transformations that has taken place in Cluj-Napoca, which has brought it very much within the realm of European, contemporary European thinking of the most advanced kind about the nature of higher education. Everything that's involved in comprehensive reform of curricula and quality scientific research, which in a globalized world has to be internationally minded. He's the author of 19 books, and I was intrigued to notice that the first book was a critical study of Herbert Marcuse. Remember him? 1980. I mentioned that, why that caught my eye, because I had many years ago when I was a student, in 1968, and that was like 40 years ago, a year of upheavals. I spent 9 months of my life on the barricades, and don't tell anybody. But one of the first journalistic articles I ever wrote in my life was, "Who's Marcuse?" This was in order to enlighten the British students who, unlike their contemporaries in Germany or France or elsewhere were perfectly aware of who Herbert Marcuse was. He's also the author of and taken a strong interest in the philosophy of Jürgen Habermas, and also of the present Pope, formerly Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. He's written extensively on the question of relativism and its consequences, which I think probably we'll also hear something about tonight in relation to our topic, on issues of education and modernization, and I would also say that his interest in Jewish themes and Jewish studies has become more evident. Recently, I participated in a colloquium at Cluj less than 2 years ago, in which Professor Marga gave a very illuminating talk about the political philosophy behind the creation of the modern state of Israel. He's written about Hannah Arendt and her concept of history, also obviously involving Jewish themes. And I think tonight's talk is also representative of the fact. A little later, I'll introduce Professor Guimont, who from the same university, who has played a very important role in the development of Jewish studies at Cluj-Napoca. To me, if I may be permitted to say this, I think it is a sign of the opening to the outer world, to Europe, to modernity, to globalization, to universalism, that under Professor Marga's inspiration and leadership, Jewish studies has come to assume the importance it has in a Romanian university, and it's become the foremost institute in Romania for doing this. And we know from our own experience at Vidal Sassoon, because we have been in association with students from this university, that this has really taken off. It has become a valuable scientific enterprise, and we're very pleased that we've been able to contribute something to that development. So I'm very happy to introduce Professor Marga tonight to this audience, and look forward to hearing your remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished audience, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers, thank Director Robert Wistrich for having invited me in this place. Invitation which honors me a lot. I know how prestigious is the Vidal Sassoon Institute, how prestigious is a Hebrew University from Jerusalem, and as a consequence, I'm living a lot of emotions in this moment. I would propose to discuss this evening on the European identity, and especially on the roots of the European identity. The European identity can be indicated, as I have shown elsewhere in a book about the European unification, only by bringing into discussion the roots or the sources or the legacies of Europe. Which are these? I would like to present my answer by analyzing one of the richest debates of the last decades, a debate which took place especially in Europe, a debate which has mobilized historians, theologians, sociologists, political scientists, philosophers. And I would like then to relaunch this debate under the, through a text condensed in the form of 8 theses. These theses altogether represent my answer to these questions, the question, which are the roots of Europe? In a long history of the efforts to derive it from only one determination or source, the Catholicism et Novalis, the consciousness of individual liberty at Hegel, the supremacy of individual in the life by et Coudenhove Kalergi, and many others, Europe has been differently described and conceptualized. But together with Nietzsche, the perspective on the European roots has beneficially changed. Europe is not longer derived from only one tradition, but from a multitude. I quote from Nietzsche: Europe means Greek culture developed from Thracian, Phoenician, Hellenistic, Philo-Hellenistic elements of the Romans, their Christian empire, the Christianity, bearer of ancient elements, from which, in the end, result in scientific centers. End of quotation. The approach of this source of Europe, which is willing to acknowledge their plurality, has begun its course of action with Nietzsche. Along this course, for instance, in the 50s, Andrei Philippe has spoken about three concepts specific to the European culture: the Greek concept of individuality, the Roman concept of justice and citizenship, and the biblical concept of a human person. Concepts with three different origins. On the same course, Karl Ratzinger has gone the farthest in characterizing Europe as a plurality of sources, of roots. In its already classic study, Europa, Verpflichtendes Erbe für die Christen, published in 1988, the famous responsible with the doctrine in Vatican identified four legacies of Europe: the Greek legacy, the Christian legacy, the Latin legacy, the modern era legacy. We are in Europe nowadays on this course, which proves to be, according to my opinion, realistic and productive. Denis de Rougemont launched a different way. He has shown that, I quote, Europe was not born from the conflict between East and West, but from the complex of the crossed tensions, the poles of which can be named with a symbolic title: Athens, Rome, and Jerusalem. Athens represents, I'm continuing the quotation, represents the discovery of the individual. Rome represents the creation of the citizen, and Jerusalem represents the revelation of the person. After Denis de Rougemont, some historians in Europe have made a well-justified distinction between the roots, les racines, of Europe, which are Athens, Rome, Jerusalem, and the so-called component or composant en français of Europe. For instance, Indo-European legacy, the Celtic contribution, the German influence, etc. It has remained open, the discussion regarding the order, the chronological order of the roots. In France, Georges Duby considered that at the beginning of the first millennium, when the Europe relevant today was formed, Jerusalem was the center. I quote, "The hope and all eyes turned back to the places where Christ lived and died, from where Christ ascended into heaven." End of quotation. On the other hand, in his book, Europe, la voie romaine, published in 1992, Rémy Brague, the famous historian of Judaism, also in Sorbonne, Rémy Brague, defended, and he defends also today, the idea of the Roman priority in the triptych Athens, Jerusalem, and Rome, arguing that the language and the infrastructure inside which Europe has been formed are aided to the Romans. I quote from his book, Europe, la voie romaine, "We are not and we cannot be Greeks and Jews because we have been Romans since the beginning." End of quotation. More recently, theologians like Eugenio Romero Pose have brought arguments for the idea that I quote, "the Europe born in the second half of the first millennium is a reality in which the Christian roots are as water which turns fertile the lands, the people of which shall unite around the path, around the camino that goes beyond the borders and brings the promise of a singular unity." End of quotation. The order of these sources inevitably remains in discussion, as it is hard to isolate one source from the other in the European Genesis itself. In the end, how could we temporally, chronologically order in Europe the Greek individualization, the Jewish revelation, and the Roman citizenship? It is impossible, practically. Under certain circumstances, at least in the Genesis of Europe, these three sources, these three roots have in fact assumed one another. It is a circumstance that is more important, and with this I hereby formulate my first thesis, that Europe stands on several sources, several roots, and that the roots or the legacies of Europe have to be differentiated from the components without having the latter minimized or downgraded. Operating with the triptych of the roots Athens, Rome, and Jerusalem, or wider with the Greek, Christian, Roman, and modern legacies, it is obvious that a religious component is situated right at the basis of Europe. No matter how far the efforts to separate the profane mentality from the religious antecedent would be taken, no matter how much we want to give autonomy to the philosophic and scientific approaches in relation with the religious atmosphere, in the end, we cannot take out of the discussion the Judeo-Christian tradition of Europe. Actually, the project, inspired by the Greek philosophy and modern sciences, by the continuous expansion of science and philosophy on the account of religion, this project could not be realized. On the top of modernity, we assist to a religious turn in today's world culture. Moreover, the effect of religiosity in human actions cannot be doubted, and they cannot be ignored. During the last decade, it has been rightfully debated the ambiguity of the separation from religion, which has been proclaimed by cultural movement of modernity. Therefore, the project of the so-called political history of religion, which will try to capture the effects of religion in the inner life that generates human activities, this project remains realistic, as it is justified the project of re-establishing the connection between the religious history, the social history, and the economic history within a synoptic explanatory strategy. Certainly, the hypothesis of a religious motivation of the economic actions is not very new. We already know that Max Weber, with his Die protestantische Ethik unter Geist des Kapitalismus, showed that the capital accrual and the orientation toward efficiency of the first modern entrepreneurs in certain parts of Europe cannot be separated from the Protestant ethics. We also know from Werner Zombard's book, Der Bürger, that in certain regions, Judaism has been more favorable to the accumulation of wealth, characteristic of capitalism, than any other confessions. Still, nowadays, with enough arguments, we can contextualize, and in a precise sign, we can relativize Max Weber and Werner Zombard's strong hypothesis. It is very clear today that the practical ideal of the self-control is found not only in Puritanism, as Max Weber thought, but in Judaism as well. Even thought it sometimes gave prevalence to the mercantile calculus. Judaism, as Freddy Raphael in France showed, Judaism has also embraced, I quote, the gratuitousness, the devotion, and the disinterest. In both cases, Max Weber and Werner Zombard, an essentialist attitude at Max Weber consisting in a preference to draw Puritanism profile by strengthening its peculiarity at the expense of comparison, and at Werner Zombard consisting in the derivation of capitalism from mercantilism and of the later from Judaism. We can, as I said, contextualize these approaches And we have to accept in the end that it is true that it does not seem possible for the authentic final attitude of Judaism to be defined. But it's important to observe its latent intention through different behaviors which have been informed along the history. It is also true to say, as in the case of Christianity, that one cannot legitimately speak about an authentic final attitude, as long as a long history has also brought a proper diversification. But this being the case, and I hereby formulate my second thesis, one cannot deny the impact of religions upon human activities. Therefore, religion will have to be acknowledged not only for its far past, but also for its recent one and for the present as a root of Europe. Nowadays, we dispose of more precise factual analysis which certify that the thresholds of the modern society that has moved on the path of secularization cannot be explained without taking religion into consideration. I shall not insist upon the truth of the deep observation made by Thomas Eliot. I quote, "Only a Christian culture could have produced a Voltaire and a Nietzsche, that is, its greatest critics." However, it has to be underlined that at the moment of the 10th century, Europe continued to be perceived as just another continent among others, and it was only the crusade and the trade that brought the self-discovering. Europe, is very clear, has been produced by Christianity, which brought the unique God and the immense individual effort to obtain redemption. This is how Christianity itself has become European. On a practical level, the elaboration and the imposing of the canonical law in Rome and living from Rome have contributed to the unification of Western Europe, having Latin as central language. It may be said that overall, the medieval Catholic and Orthodox Europeans, and later the Protestants, have been very close to one another through the acknowledgement and the dispersion of the same Judeo-Christian values, the fundaments of a Weltanschauung which have lasted until our days, and have impregnated our also secular societies. Still, even the most secular evolutions in Europe, the reference to revelation and to the divine order has remained at least a current open theme. The modern European law cannot be dissociated genetically from the compiling of the ancient manuscripts, which has as a result the Theodosian Code, the Justinian Roman legislation, and most of all, from the reunion by the Church of the rightful clerical and pontifical regulation under the famous Decree of Gratian, and the comments of Irnerius et Digesta. Subsequently, in Bologna and Paris, the academic transfer of the law to the new generations opened. However, the canonical law was the one that started the historical series that led to the modern law in Europe. Anyway, the Church played the major role. The Church, we have to say, was the only stable element during the Middle Age. The institutions of the Church have been not only ecclesiastic, but they also bring a remarkable unity to the medieval world. In the European public debate, we are still controlled by the conviction of the irreducible opposition between modern science and religion. A lot of people use old arguments in order to defend the idea of this opposition. And we saw in the debates around La Sapienza in Rome how strong is this, the belief in this opposition. Meanwhile, we have attempts to dismiss the misunderstandings from the relation between the Church, Christianity, and the advocates of the unconditional scientific research, and to prepare the field for, as a French colleague, Georges Minois said, for a new synthesis. More recently, Hans Küng has launched with his book, Der Anfang aller Dinge, published in 2006, new approaches for the religious signification of the great recent scientific researches. And an interrogation has gained importance based on the efforts to understand the modern genesis of science in Europe. As the critics of the logical positivism from almost a century ago, which took the modern program of the settlement of the science autonomy the farthest, all these critics have already argued the modern science genesis was not isolated of the extra-scientific premises. First of all, of the need of unbinding from the technical problems. Today, it is far more clear than ever before that we cannot explain the modern science genesis without taking into consideration the assumptions of a unitary universe set by regularity, which relate to the monotheism. We cannot explain the genesis of the modern social sciences without taking into consideration the ideas of justice, equality, responsibility, and the higher order to which they relate to, that come from the Judaic ethics of justice and from the Christian ethics of one's love for his fellow man. Even the birth of the moral conscience, understood as a normative conscience and having as support the inner need, cannot be explained without the Old Testament and the epistle to the Romans of Apostle Paul. We may say that the modern ethics was obviously inspired by the sources of the Bible. Hermann Cohen was right to draw the attention upon the fact that not only Christianity, but Judaism as well, has post-biblical developments, and that I quote, the truly living God, the one that the prophets of Israel have transformed into the God of Israel and the God of humanity, breathes only within the social ethics and the universal humanity. End of quotation. Based on this universal ethics and humanity, the moral conscience was formed. These things, liberties, institutions, law, natural sciences, social sciences, and moral conscience, as Europe produced them and then spread them around the world, are connected to the religion, to the Judeo-Christian tradition. They are connected to the religion that Europe took from Jerusalem and developed it as its own religion, Christianity. The third thesis that I am defending is that Europe was formed through the compound action of several components and legacies on which Christianity left its marks. It united them and it gave them a direction. In the book published in 2006, Le radici cristiane d'Europa, the author Eugenio Romero Pose recently argued convincingly that the concept of Europa Christiana, indicating the overwhelming importance of evangelism, is a historical example of inculturalization, with political consequences that claim their own social structure. The result of this inculturalization was a proposal to adopt the individual liberty ensured by the bond with God and with the salvific message of Jesus of Nazareth as an indispensable condition of people's life unity and of every individual's life. Today we find ourselves after a profound turning point in self-understanding the European Christianity. First of all, we are situated after the reconstruction of the life and action of Jesus of Nazareth based only on the Gospels and the New Testament that could be observed at Hegel and even at Ernst Renan. Meanwhile, new manuscripts, archaeological discoveries, the access to the Hebrew texts, the rabbinic sources, and many others enrich the information, so that the generations that live nowadays make known Jesus better than any other previous generation. One cannot talk now about a biography of Jesus, but one may say that there is no other ancient personality about whom the humanity has so much information today. Even the famous collection Schürer, published in 1911, which gathered almost a century of discoveries in the Holy Land, is exceeded nowadays in a good sense. Then we are situated after the Rabbi Leo Beck's reaction to Adolf von Harnack, Das Wesen des Christentums, in which the historical research of Jesus, relaunched by the well-known Protestant theologians, has been opposed to the argument that the historical Jesus cannot be profoundly enough understood if it is not seen as a part of the Jewish community of time. The formula, I quote from Leo Beck, a Jew among Jews, represents the convention of our time. We are situated after the book Der Stern der Erlösung, in which Franz Rosenzweig interpreted Christianity and Judaism as two paths to redemption, between which it is a role of God to decide and to give the signs of the supreme decision. We are after a great series of Christian monographies that have Christian monographs that have seen Jesus as a part of Judaism of that time. A Jew among Jews. I mean, Bultmann, Sanders, to the recent authors like Klausberger and Schnackenburg. I have in mind also the Jewish reference monographs from Ben-Shorin, Pinhas Lapid, and David Flusser, who have accurately established the signification of many biblical formula and have stated, at least through Pinhas Lapid, that the entire difference between Jews and Christians, so famous and so frequently manipulated in history, is in the hands of God. And we are after the document Dominus Jesu, published in 2000, in which, at that time, Karl Ratzinger expressed his conviction that Judaism and Christianity are not two different religions, but one religion with two paths to redemption. Finally, we are after the argumentation of many theologians, and I remind you of Norbert Lochwing, who has shown that the famous covenant between God and Jews had never been abrogated, and that under its auspices the people of Israel continues its complex and glorious history. In a situation after so many profound changes in the self-understanding of Christianity, which has left its mark on Europe's shape, even a relationship itself between Christianity and Judaism has to be restored. One can feel even nowadays the echo of Karl Barth's famous statement, I quote, "The problem is not what can the synagogue do without Jesus Christ. The problem is another," said Karl Barth. "What is a church as long as it is a stranger to the legacy of Israel?" Nowadays, it is clearer than ever. After the Apostles' era, Jesus has separated the ancient Christians from the Jews, but now Jesus could unite them. This does not mean to level the differences. But following Martin Buber, one may admit that not all things have been said between Emunah, the Jewish belief, they make reference to the history of a people, and Pistis, the Christian belief in Jesus. Recent researches, such as one in the book Les Racines Juives du Christianisme, published in France in 2006, have legitimately, I think, proposed the Christian assuming of the circumstance that the ethics of Jesus is typical Jewish, and the detachment from the different leveling between Judaism and Christianity, as well as from ignoring the Jewish ancestry of Jesus. Giving value to the Augustine famous statement regarding the relation between the two testaments, Novus Testament in vetere later, vetus in nover patet, Frederick Mans in France proposed, legitimately I think, to reshape the conception of the relationship between Jesus and Israel, Jesus and Israel. Instead of the substitution model, there is a model of difference and partnership between Christianity and Judaism, which is defended by the French authors. It is only the latter that manages to face the rich data of which we dispose nowadays, saying the historical Jesus in relationship with the Jesus of the eschatology. Therefore, my fourth thesis is the following. Christianity, full conscious of its ancestry, cannot consider Judaism as being anything else than a part of the same religion, and together with Christianity, Judaism has played, in its turn, the role of root, of the culture, of the European culture, the culture that we are living. A series of historians have indicated Athens, Rome, and Jerusalem as being the symbols of Europe's roots. What does each one give us? Summarizing great researches undertook for decades, one may say that from Athens we have the rationality, the shared rationality, the language of disciplines, the basic philosophical conceptualization, the democracy, the dialectic, the fine arts. We owe to Rome the cities, the roads, the architecture, the cadastre, the cartography, the law, and the universal empire. Above all, one may say with some French historians, I quote, however, all Europeans are still marked by Christianity and through Christianity by Judaism. End of quotation. Basically, the Jews have been the first Christians, and the Europeans have subsequently become Christians. The Jewish Bible, in fact the so-called Old Testament, has shaped the sensibility, the world vision, and the European language, which can be seen in current life, in sciences, in arts, in philosophy. The great European archetypes, the creation, the end of the world, the individuals as the image of God, the woman created from the man's rib, the lost paradise, the arrival of Messiah, the judgment day, all are owed to the Pentateuch. A few months ago, an assiduous researcher, Andrei, published in Paris impressive volume La Bible et l'Occident, de la Bibliothèque d'Alexandrie à la culture européenne, which presented a well-known process, but still little explained in the basic articulation. The passage of the Bible, Judaic and Christian, from the patrimony of certain Jewish elite in the hypostasis of founding book of the European culture, which all the historical meanders involved. Not always did authenticity count in the undertaking. So when the Jerusalem Bible replaced Vulgata, it has been a great step ahead from the point of view of undertaking the Veritas Hebraica, to which the Europeans have often aspired. However, nowadays we are in a full process of history reconstruction through which the Jerusalem culture has marked the entire world. Therefore, my fifth thesis is that only the triangle Jerusalem, Athens, Rome embodies the cultural fundament of Europe. The reestablishment of the triangle Jerusalem, Athens, Rome is certainly an enormous step before acknowledging the cultural fundament of Europe. Only that this triangle is not solely for the past, but it can also inspire the establishment of a pattern for the further evolution in Europe. In this sense, there is a salutary progress of the researches that restore the importance of Christianity, of the Greek and Roman legacy in the formation of the European identity, as well as there is a progress in the effort to settle the contribution of different components of Europe. Obviously, however, The formula of Christianity as a synthesis between the legacy from Jerusalem and the Greek thinking have to be revised every time it implied the diminution of what came from Judaism. On the other hand, together with the progress of reconstituting the history of Judaism and of the Jewish thinking, especially as a result of the setting up of the state of Israel on the ancient land of Jews, a brand new image of the historical role of Judaism in the development of Europe has been articulated. I have in mind two facts from the multitude of the representative ones. In 1974, Gershon Scholem gave his monumental description in the volume La Kabbale. I took in consideration the French translation, but Scholem is universal, through which Gershon Scholem wanted to prove the importance of the Jewish mystic not only for the Jewish history, but also for the contemporary thinking. One of the results of this learned analysis from this writing interests us here. The probation of the idea that the Tzimtzum theory, formulated by Yitzhak Luria, Ashkenazi, in the 16th century, theory according to which all premeditated theological moments are fundamentally a subject of the immanent natural need. This theory has passed into Europe through Jacob Böhme and afterwards through Knorr von Rosenroth to the assumptions, to the premises of the German classic philosophy, which made possible the social sciences in Germany and implicitly in Europe. In fact, one cannot separate the genesis of the European social sciences from the effects of the Kabbalah, cultivated for centuries by the brilliant Jewish thinking. In 2003, in a book in the honor of Jacques Derrida, Moshe Idel emphasized the ascendance of the famous philosopher Jacques Derrida formula Il n'est rien en dehors du texte in the Italian Kabbalist Menahem Recanati in the 16th century, who, as we know, has initiated the identification of Torah with God. It is very clear that, according to this argumentation, Derrida in fact connected the combinatory logic of Abulafia's Kabbalah with a conception regarding the role of possession for Stéphane Mallarmé. The conclusion is that Derrida's philosophy, with a universal importance, fits from different sources, Greek as well as Jewish, and the latter continues to enrich the history of philosophy in Europe. In a justified manner, Moshe Idel, I think, explains one of his presuppositions. I quote this wonderful idea. In the Europe of the Middle Ages and of the Renaissance, the cultures, separated by significant differences, have exercised a substantial action one upon another. End of quotation. Moshe Idel rightfully, I think, draws the attention that postmodernism, for instance, does not represent a bridge from modernity, as original as it claims, but rather a movement to center again on certain forms, much elder, of intellectual preoccupation, which characterizes other periods of the European history. I believe that it's right to question the self-understanding of Europe, which is more willing to capture not only the continuities of the consecrated legacies, but also differentiation within them. In fact, the conceptualizations that we operate with, due to great philosophers like Hegel, Nietzsche, Husserl, Heidegger, these conceptualizations have just started to be confronted with the results of the latest historical investigation. Therefore, and with this I defend my sixth thesis, I would like to underline that establishing the contributions of different legacies to the articulation of today's European identity as before, is in incipient phases, and the years to come will offer us a major enrichment of Europe's founding triangle. Certainly, the orientation of the debate on the European identity prevailing upon the past inevitably arouses the following question. Why is it that, in the end, we almost reflexively direct ourselves towards the past when we have to deal with present problems? Gershom Scholem reminds us in the end of his extraordinary book, Le Grand Courant de la Mystique Juive, of a very eloquent anecdote regarding the spiritual evolution of the humanity. When Baal Shem, the great master of Kabbalah, had to solve a difficult problem, he would go in a certain place in the forest, he would light the fire, and meditate a prayer, and what he wanted to happen came true. When 1 generation later, another master had to solve the same problem, he went in the same place, the forest, and said, "We can no longer light the fire, but we can still pray." And what he wanted came true. Another generation later, a rabbi faced the same problem. Therefore, he went to the same place in the forest and he said, "We can no longer light the fire, we no longer know the sacred meditations related to the prayer, but we still know that place in the forest." This was enough to have his wish fulfilled. With the fourth generation, a rabbi who was sitting in his golden chair, probably in north of Romania, in his castle, facing the same problem, said, "We can no longer light the fire, we can no longer pray, we no longer know the place in the forest, but we can tell the history of what has happened." Gershom Scholem drew the right conclusion. The anecdote reflects not only the decline of the great movement that was the Kabbalah, but something more. I quote, "A transformation of all values, a transformation so profound that, in the end, all that has left from the mystery is to write the history." End of quotation. However, it does not end with the writing of history, as the needs that have always fed the greatest culture initiatives can lead to other new major initiatives of this type. I hereby undertake on my own Gershom Scholem's observation regarding the transformation of our values, which has recently taken place in the European history, together with the faith that new major culture initiatives are indispensable and possible. The prophets, and not the professor, said Scholem, will be able to announce them. For now, I formulate my seventh thesis, the conviction that we are establishing the European identity rather through history, as long as the visions, the comprehensive visions, are in a crisis, at least in Europe. Europe always remains itself continuing its own history, but then adding newer and newer visions with sources in its consecrated roots. Europe's crises, which have been, at least in the history of the last century, economic crisis, crisis with relation between countries, rationality crisis, legitimacy crisis, and so on, Europe's crisis take in the last decades the shape of a motivation crisis. This motivation crisis has a precise indicator in the significant difference between the number of those who want to use the democratic rights and liberties and the number of those willing to make sacrifices when need to be in order to defend democracy. Between those who, otherwise said, take advantage of the multicultural frame of the new Europe after the war, and those willing to promote the universality of rights and the liberty of persons. A retreat in consumption from the moral duties, the refuge in the private area in relation to the citizenship obligations, preferring particularism of lifestyle before the interrogation of the human condition, preferring local affiliations instead of the relation to the general horizon, are noticed in many parts of Europe. Such retreats are intensified exactly during the longest peace period from the European history, with the most spectacular technological achievements. I think the debate Habermas-Ratzinger in Munich in 2004 adequately expressed the motivation crisis in the context of thematizing cultural resources that integrate the democratic state. Where does the actual motivation crisis in Europe come from? I consider that the source of this crisis can be identified precisely. I have in view the degradation of democracy into proceduralism and the reduction of multiculturalism to a coexistence of different cultures. However, by formulating this diagnosis, it is not about ignoring the importance of procedures for democracy and the importance of cultures' coexistence for multiculturalism. Problems do not begin with proceduralism and respectively with the culture's coexistence, but with the reduction of democracy to the application of procedures and the reduction of multiculturalism to the simple coexistence. In this situation, in which democracy has to be assumed as more than just a technique, as John Dewey said, of periodical choice of leaders, that is, as a form of life, in which multiculturalism has to be assumed as more than just a simple coexistence of the different cultures, that is, as a value inspiring for creation. In this situation, there is a more and more perceptible need for new visions. My thesis, the 8, is that the motivation crisis, in fact the paralysis, relative or substantial, of the indispensable initiatives cannot be overcome without new universalist visions. Another universalism, in my view, a universalism of generative structures, is necessary, is quite compulsory. However, for this new universalism, the Judaic tradition and the Christian ones continue to be roots, the roots that have not been lost along the years in the rubble of history, but living roots from which new olive trees of hope arise. One who would try to build an opinion about our current situation is faced with two facts. On the one hand, the globalization, the spreading of communication, connect people from all around the world, from different cultures. On the other hand, when people take reference point of evaluation and behavior, they relate, first of all, to their own culture. Thus, despite the pressure of creating a global identity, the big majority of the people come up with particular identity, ethnical, religious, of gender, etc. In his volume, Philosophy as Cultural Politics, published in 2007, Richard Rorty makes our entire reality dependent on our own cultural arsenal. We have become, he said, commonsensical finitists. And the only thing we have left is to promote a tolerant conversability, without assuming any other intrinsic nature of the reality. According to Rorty, a contextual relativism is inevitable. Even granting this intelligent philosophy the merit of expressing better than any other in the modern era the possibility of different conceptualization having a series of facts as its object, we cannot shun a deeper insight into the unacceptable consequences of relativism. The spokesmen of great trends, thinkers with different platforms, from Karl Popper to Habermas and to Joseph Ratzinger, have evoked them convincingly, I think. Relativism is quickly converted into a dogma that contradicts its principle, all is relative, and stimulates the destruction of the unity of humankind, with all implications that result from it. Relativism does not adequately take into consideration the human process of learning, which does not reduce itself to information, but which means the change of thinking, frames and boxes. Relativism, by its own principle, does not take into consideration the natural tenets of conversation, of speaking in general, that of obtaining the understanding between different rival points of view. Recently, a remarkable physicist reminded us that due to the several factors, the competition in research, the pressure from the society to transfer scientific knowledge, the search for funds, the unstable work situation, due to such factors, the new generations of intellectuals, the new students, engage in more factual research, looking solutions for problems on short term without committing themselves to far-reaching projects. We may add that this is a situation not only in the field of scientific research, but it is connected to a more comprehensive orientation of the culture toward facts, immediate customs. And I remember that in the 80s, in the famous speech delivered in front of the Spanish parliament, Habermas identified as one of the consequences of this orientation the apparent, he said, Exhausten of the utopian energies, Erschöpfung der utopischen Energien. The dominant direction in today's culture, said Habermas, is that of exploiting what is given rather than asking what is possible. Moreover, a negative futurism is developed around this maxim. Let's leave things the way they are because it may be worse. Anyway, the physicist I quoted, a famous colleague from, physicist from Firenze, Paolo Blasi, drew this conclusion. The challenge, I quote, the challenge of the European society today is to go as far as possible beyond the knowledge society and to evolve into what could be called a wisdom society. Indeed, this is an effective and pressing problem. Let's put in motion a wisdom capable of enlightening people about their own responsibility. I believe that my colleague Blasi, a refined physicist, is too optimistic when he speaks about the, I quote, restoration of some medieval values. He thought the quest for truth, the unity of knowledge, the openness to the unknown and to other cultures. I think that a simple restoration is improbable because of the new complexity of the society, of the modern society. But I think Paolo Blasi is right when he considers that today's universities, today's intellectuals, have the responsibility of setting a larger and greater goal than producing and transmitting knowledge. Responsibility of setting the project of elaborating visions in the projection of a developed and peaceful world. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Marga, for having given us this overview in which you touched on so many different themes that our respondent is not going to have an easy task, although I'm sure he'll be able to cope. Just two thoughts very quickly. One is a feeling I had for many years, and listening to you, it was strengthened still further, that the more that Europe in recent decades moved away from its own Christian roots in a strange, unexpected, and for Jewish consciousness, a surprising way, things have got worse for the Jews rather than better. In other words, the expectations in terms of how Europeans might look at, particularly about the problems of Israel, it seems to me the more that Europe was in danger or is in danger of being de-Christianized in some ways, it is losing its capacity to empathize and understand the broader historical, philosophical, political, moral significance of what Israel's existence means in itself and for Europe. That's one thought. The other is, particularly when you spoke about relativism, I couldn't help thinking of that famous, wonderful remark attributed to Albert Einstein, who founded, of course, the theory of relativity, as we all know. But then, when confronted with quantum mechanics, said the famous words, God does not throw dice. He was so upset. In fact, he never really resolved that problem. And relativism has created so many issues, obviously in the field of morality and values and culture, that, again, I feel, if I may be a little bit parochial, that this has not worked out very well for the Jews either. And that's another issue. A few words about our next speaker, Moshe Idel. It's very strange to introduce somebody you've known for many years. And you always think, is there anything new that I could possibly discover or know about a colleague and somebody who is a contemporary and I've known for a long time. And actually, when they went to the computer and consulted the Wikipedia, which is supposed to be the authority these days, don't trust it ever, I discovered a new fact, which I hope is correct, but I never knew this. I knew that you'd been born in Romania. I knew that you were a professor in the Department of Jewish Thought, Machshevet Israel, at the Hebrew University, and a whole list of impressive works about mysticism, Kabbalah, Messianism, including a more recent one, Mekubalim Shel Laila. Is that the last one? Mekubalim Shel Laila. Last but not for long, Yerushalayim Carmel 2006. And, of course, the various works from dating way back and continuing on Abraham Abulafia. What I didn't know, which really astonished me, was that you had served Behandasa Kravit, B'Tzahal. And I must say, I still can't figure out the connection. Ech higata leze, you know, and how one graduates from Handasa Kravit to the higher realms of Kabbalah and mysticism and many other things too. I'm sure that Moshe Idel, who has a long list of distinguished prizes, but as you all know, Pras Yisrael among them, will also enlighten you about his previous encounters with Professor Marga, and we're fortunate for the first time, as far as I know, at least in English, to have a new edition of this ongoing saga. Moshe.
So, you heard that I was born in Romania, but I didn't return after 1963 for many, many years. In 1997, under some pressure, I decided to return for some hours for a conference on Jewish studies in Cluj, Napoca. And then I'm listening to the opening of the conference on Jewish studies to Professor Marga speaking about the role of Judaism in European culture. Knowing a little bit Romania, I knew that people are delivering a little bit less than they promise. However, it was a great mistake. After a year, Professor Marga was Minister of Culture, and he immediately delivered much more than he promised. And since then, he continues to actually disillusion me about Romania, because what happens, in fact, not only claiming the importance of the Jewish element in European culture, but also, as you heard earlier, penetrating more and more and discussing issues which I don't believe there are many rectors in the world, including our university, that could deliver such a lecture. So let me attempt to react only to one of the three parts of the triad mentioned earlier as the basis of European culture. That's the Jerusalem element. Being in Jerusalem, at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, I shall try a little bit, nevertheless, to deconstruct it. First, by using the term Jerusalem, we are already limiting, willingly or not, Judaism to the biblical Judaism. That's not always the case, but that is the implication. So let me attempt to enumerate a little bit developments in Judaism which are important, which are not exactly coming from Jerusalem, and very important for Europe, in my opinion. First, let me distinguish between pre-Christian Judaism, which produced the Christ. The Christ was a Jew from Nazareth, also a little bit in Jerusalem, representing some form of pre-Christian Judaism, even Christ. The eschatological vision was very, very powerful in this period, and the Christ is one of the possibilities. Jewish pre-Christian religion offered to the development of religion and Europe especially. Then we have a mutation, if you like. Greek Judaism. Philo of Alexandria. Deeply different from the Palestinian Judaism. A synthesis which left a very strong impact on very early Christian theology, including Paul, but for sure the classical Christian theology, Origen, for example, but many, many others, who learned theology from an Hellenistic Jew or the Greek Jew. The Greek Jews never disappeared with Philo. There were many Greek Jews long after. One of them, who is going to become the topic of a conference in some months in Cluj, is Maimonides, a Greek Jew. Not only a Greek Jew, also a rabbinic Jew, but for sure a Greek Jew. Without Maimonides, it's very difficult to understand some elements in scholastic thought, including Thomas of Aquinas, who, in a way or another, was also influenced by Philo. But he is also quoting Maimonides, who shaped, he's just one of the Greek Jews in the Middle Ages. There are also others in Gabirol, who people didn't know that he's Jewish. And here we have another vision of Judaism, philosophical, to a certain extent systematic, reflective, less performative, which had an impact on certain century forms of Jewish and Christian European thought more than in any other place in the world, including the Islamic world, despite the fact that the Guide of the Perplexed was written in Arabic. So we have another trajectory of the Greek Jews who remained influential for some elements of Christian thinking, not by offering something very original, but by imposing a certain synthesis between the classical forms of Judaism, biblical and rabbinic, and an openness toward the Greek philosophical culture. And together with Maimonides, there is a pleiad, if you like, of other Jews who contributed in this direction, many translators. No one can imagine Christian thought without translations of Jews made in Toledo in 12th and 13th century. It's still an issue which should be developed. Then we have another third important form of Judaism. So we have the first one, not to forget, eschatological Jew, pre-Christian, represented by Jesus, deep influence on Christianism. Then we have the theological Judaism of Philo, deep influence on early Christian theology, reverberating in the Middle Ages, and enforced by new forms of Greek Jews, like Maimonides and the translators in Gabirol and a long series of others. Third, the post-Rabbinic Jews. That's the modern Jews. I'm calling them post-Rabbinic for reasons you will understand immediately. People who, without denying of being of Jewish extraction, don't know too much on Judaism, and nevertheless, they consider themselves, or others consider them, to be Jewish. Names are known. Freud, just one of them. Here we have another influence. Here we have, in fact, representatives of thinkers. We can add Adorno, closer to Habermas and Professor Marga. We have an attitude very characteristic of a series of Jews writing in something like during 100 years, which changed, in my opinion, the vision of what culture is. We can add Popper and Marcuse and Leo Strauss. If we look to what seems to me to be the common denominator, it is the critical attitude. People who can be described, in fact, as thinkers of discontent, for whom whatever form of order exists is not sufficient, should be criticized, maybe could be improved, Ernst Bloch. But here we have a totally different vision of Jewish contribution. So let me return to Europe. What did Europe do to the pre-Christian Jews who remained Jewish in a pre-Christian way, without being philosophers like Maimonides, without being critical like their later co-religionists? Actually, those Jews were eliminated. If we look to the map of the Holocaust, in fact, attached basically the pre-Christian Jews. The big figures like Marcuse or Hannah Arendt or Hans Jonas, and you can enumerate a long series of critical Jews, they escaped. Hardly you can find a major name of the critical post-Rabbinic Jews who perished in the Holocaust. Some of them were affected later because of the Holocaust, which is another story. But basically, hard to find. Maybe Bruno Schulz. Hard to find, in fact. The millions of Jews exterminated were the pre-Christian Jews. The critical Jews escaped. Some of them to Israel, some of them to America, some of them survived a little bit in Europe for a while. In my opinion, in order for Europe to recuperate the treasures of criticism, this form of critical form of Judaism should be moved more to the center. Europe cannot because of its Christian background. And I would like not to enter too much. If there are going to be questions, I shall answer. Cannot recuperate what is called Jerusalem. That is a story which the Holocaust only demonstrated, the end of it. But we have a long series of pogroms which demonstrate that Jews who want to emphasize their total difference and live even separately in ghettos or shtetls in Europe, in a way or another, are not going to flourish. So the only form of Judaism that is possible today to recuperate from the point of view of the European thinking is a certain form of criticism of the society. By proposing what I'm saying, I must confess that I learned from the one before, the last book of Professor Marga on Habermas, who also remarked that, in fact, what happened in German philosophy is the loss of the interbellic part of German philosophy. However, it seems to me important not only to look to the inner history of German philosophy, and to a certain extent he is writing in a way which is pointing to an attempt to repair German philosophy. However, it seems to me that it will be better for Europe to look not only for the interbellic, because in the interbellic we find thinkers who won't be so, how to put it, palatable to Habermas, like Leo Strauss, for example. But this idea of cultivating a certain elite which is found on the margin of the majority and on the margin of a minority, I'm emphasizing, on the margin of the majority and minority together, Derrida is the most perfect example. You can imagine in France someone who is of Algerian extraction, but not Ashkenazi, and not exactly French, is renovating, in fact, not only German philosophy, despite the fact that he was deeply influenced also by German philosophy, but renovating, in fact, human thought in general. So I would say that the Jerusalem syndrome should be divided into three major components. Only the third has a chance in Europe to fertilize further development because of the marginal situation of Jews emerging out of the minority but not entering the majority situation. So, for the time being, speaking about scholarship related to early Christianity or to Christianity in general, there's no doubt that we have a return to a deep interest in Judaism. No doubt we can see it in the interest in early Jewish mysticism, in Qumran literature, in Echalot literature, but in most of the cases, the Jews are conceived to be, or the Jewish sources, the background of. And here we have a certain fascinating development. A lot of Christian scholars, fine scholars, are contributing to Jewish studies only because they are the background of Christian development. I cannot regulate what anyone is doing. That wouldn't be an academic enterprise. But it seems to me that we are still in a situation of the Jews as the informant for a better understanding of Christianity. maybe the time will come when people will start to study Judaism for a better understanding of Judaism. At least that is or should be the role of the Hebrew University. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Moshe, both for those very stimulating remarks and also for having kept going through the darkness, proving once again there's always that proverbial light at the end of the tunnel. I would like now just to invite a comment from another distinguished guest, Professor Ladislav Guillemant from Babeș-Bolyai University, who is the head of the, that's not the name of the center, of the Dr. Moshe Carmeli Institute for Hebrew and Jewish History at Napoca, Cluj-Napoca. And he has been very instrumental, major figure in the development of Jewish studies there, which is flourishing at the moment. And I would just like, in the light of your last comment, he might want to add something on how it looks from Romania, if you'd like to come here.
Professor Wistrich, Rector Marga, Professor Idel, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, it is my very sincere duty to thank very gratefully to this opportunity to be here and to speak in front of such a distinguished audience about a very important issue of today, Europe, but I dare to say of the world, globalized world. This issue of the roots of the European unity, it's, as Professor Wistrich said, a very burning question today. And it is, of course, a first question. Why in the Vidal Sassoon Center for study of anti-Semitism, we will deal with this problem of the roots of the United Europe? In my opinion, it's a very, very strong connection. While today, it's my opinion, if anti-Semitism would diminish or even sometime disappear from Europe, this will be the consequence of the unifying process of the European continent. Until we will be the prisoners of a nation-state vision about Europe, the anti-Semitism will live and will consist a permanent danger. Of course, it is right that the present-day European Union is not exactly an example of behavior concerning this issue, but we have to have in front of us an ideal image of Europe. And this ideal image could not be but a united Europe, a unity in diversity, which will put an end to every discrimination, including this label of anti-Semitism. Of course, if we agree with this, naturally the problem of the roots of Europe are essential also from our point of view, because the European unification process, we all know this, is a process of a very dialectic one. It was a long series of compromises. All the time there were crises. All the time it was necessary to find a solution. And fortunately, this solution always appeared, but every compromise is also a sacrifice. And in this moment, we obtained again a new compromise, is the Lisbon Treaty. Of course, we had great ambitions to have a constitution of Europe, to put the basis of the European unified state, the dream of the United States of Europe, etc., etc. The Lisbon Treaty is far from this, we have to recognize. But it is more than nothing. 2 years ago, after the French and Holland examples, it was a great danger that it will be a very, very strong crisis. And Europe managed to get through, and today we have this little result, but result. Unfortunately, it remained, the part of the sacrifice was that it was sacrificed the problem of the identity, of the European identity. Lastly, this problem was let away from the Lisbon Treaty, but it doesn't mean that this problem is not very important and it's not essential for the further evolution. And from this point of view, I would like to congratulate the Vidal Sassoon Center for this brilliant and courageous idea to start a new discussion here. And, of course, to invite a personality who is very deeply involved in this topic by his books, by his practical activity. And, of course, as rector of the Babes-Bolyai University, Professor Marga represents here not only himself, but represents also an institution which is deeply involved in this process of solving the European unity's further questions. And why this? Because, and I am very proud to say this here, this week we had as a guest the High Commissioner for Minorities of the OSCE, that means the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and his last statement about his experience in Cluj was that Babes-Bolyai University is a model for the whole European higher education. Why this? Because in Cluj was implemented, due to the idea of Professor Marga and to his practical activity, together with all of us, was to implement the so-called multicultural model of university. And this model is important because at the beginning of the 90s, in our part of Europe was a great danger of conflicts and of ethnical conflicts especially. And in spite of that, today Transylvania, Romania is an oasis of stability. And this stability is due in a very important measure to the idea of funding such a multicultural university, which offers the possibility of a smooth cooperation and coexistence of different ethnical, confessional groups. Of course, I would like not to extend discussion about this model. I would like to say only, as representative of two institutions which were inspired and founded by Rector Marga, it is the Faculty of European Studies in the Babes-Bolyai University and the Institute of Jewish Studies, the Moshe Carmeli Institute for Hebrew and Jewish History, that these two institutions are, I dare to say this, an important component of this multicultural model, and we are able to give our contribution to the problems like this identity question of Europe. How this? I think that today the speech of Rector Marga was a very good beginning for our common contribution in this debate. And the second possibility will be, as Professor Idel mentioned, and whose guidance is very important for us in organizing the event, will be the conference in October organized in cooperation by the Institute of European Research, which is headed by Professor Marga, by the Maimonides Institute in Montpellier, and by the Carmeli Institute in Cluj, a conference on the role of the impact of Maimonides on the European culture, on the European scholarship. I think that such debates will pave the way, will open the possibility for Europe to discuss these issues, to have new ideas, to keep alive this problem of identity from the point of view of the contribution of Judaism and Christianism to these roots. And we hope for the future. We have some plans for 2009 to organize another conference concerning a leading figure of the modernity, the Jewish contribution to the modernity of Europe, that means Moses Mendelssohn. So I would like to hope that this evening is a very good continuation of our so important cooperation with the Vidal Sassoon Center. We are very happy that we are here in the prestigious Hebrew University. And of course, we would like to invite all those present to be our partners in this so important process of debate on European unity, on the roots of the European identity, on the role of Judaism and Christianism in this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Giamant, for underlining what I think was already the main thrust of Professor Marga's comments, which is how this opening up, in this case, it happened to be from Romania, but it really in itself is less important than the fact that the more that the model of openness, multiculturalism may be problematic in some places, but it seems to be working pretty well in your part of the world, and we could definitely learn from each other. And I think Jewish studies has an important part to play in this, and not just symbolically, and I think this has been touched on. You opened a window to a comment I would like to invite from Professor Michael Shafir, who deals with European and international studies, in fact directs them as far as I'm aware, at Cluj University, and is very much a man of the world, of many cultures and societies, and is, I think, very well qualified to add a few remarks to what you just said.
Thank you. As I was on my way to listen, I didn't know I would talk. I haven't prepared anything, but I couldn't help thinking, well, this is but one of a series of transformation, metamorphosis that my life can be all about. And I'd like you, I was asked to talk for 5 minutes about what I do at Babesh Boye. I'll do neither, but I'll try to do both. I'll start with the end. Rector Andrei Marga is responsible for one of my last metamorphoses. I became a specialist in international relations. And I want to tell you about how that happened. I underwent many metamorphoses, some of them totally uninteresting for this audience. But if I am to talk about my changes, my first change is due to my alma mater, to this place. And I'm very moved to talk from here. I think there were 4 main figures that influenced me for better or worse. The first is no longer with us, unfortunately. He was named Yaakov Talmon. And from him I learned how important self-sarcasm is. Just to illustrate it in one thing, he stepped in the first lesson we had with him, huge auditorium, and he said, in order to be a good historian, one needs 3 things. First is memory, and I forgot the other 2. The second was Professor Shlomo Avineri. I've learned a lot of things from Shlomo Avineri. I might have learned how to say those things brilliantly, not as brilliantly as he does. But one of the things I'll never forget learning from him is that you cannot be tolerant to what you agree with. You have to be tolerant with what you disagree with. The third person was a man that perhaps influenced me more than anyone else, and his name is Zev Sternel. From Zev Sternel, I learned that tolerance itself is a dirty word. That tolerance is not the same with acceptance. Finally, the last person, I haven't had the privilege of having him as a teacher, but I've read a lot of his works, and God bless him with that again. His name is Judah Bauer. And from him I learned the most terrible things that confirmed what Sternel has taught me. I quote, "The most terrible thing about the Holocaust is not that it was contrary to human nature. On the contrary." These are the things that have guided me through my life. And when I accepted to go to Radio Free Europe as research director, unlike what some people think, I've never been a journalist at Radio Free Europe, but elsewhere. But there's nothing wrong with being a journalist, believe me. In any case, when I did that, I did it also in the hope of combating what it was clear to me was the most wrong, most terrible thing about communism: imposture. Because communism was not Marxism applied. It was an impostured Marxism. I'm not a Marxist, but I've never been one. But that was the most important thing. And you'll see why I am mentioning that. Because my third transformation was due to a man whom I've never met. His name is Mikhail Gorbachev. If he didn't do what he did, I'd probably be broadcasting or writing at Radio Free Europe even today. When the possibility was given to me to contribute to democratization, I never thought to move back to Romania. But then I was shocked to discover something else. That many of my friends whom I thought that I was fighting together with for the democratization of Romania turned out to be anti-Semites all of a sudden. And they created my fourth life transformation. I was converted to Judaism. Having been born a Jew, I never knew what Judaism was really about till that happened. Professor Marga made this fantastic offer. Him knowing what I didn't know. I was a political scientist and historian, but of course, at Radio Free Europe, I dealt with international relations all the time. So like Molière's famous character, I was talking all my life prose without knowing it. Professor Marga knew it. And I took over this Department for International Relations, about which I want to say a few words now. Of course, Romania didn't have the possibility of really teaching international relations. It had the possibility of applying them at the top, but teaching was something else. I have to carry on my shoulders many undergraduate introductory courses. One of them is called Theory of International Relations. And I teach the different approaches. I don't want to bother you with them, but just a very quick review. Realism connected with the philosophy of Hobbes, and idealism connected with philosophy of Kant, Marxism, we all think we know what it's about, globalism, but I teach one approach which maybe not is not that well known. This is called social constructivism. And social constructivism teaches, among other things, that we see in the other what we believe about ourselves. And here's the greatest point ever made, I think, in international relations studies. You cannot go into treaties with someone whom you judge by what you think that one should be. We teach at undergraduate, at graduate, and at doctoral studies. We are at the beginning, but it's a guided beginning, because we got a lot of encouragement from our rector, who immediately grasped the importance. One of the main things I did when coming to Babeș Bolyai was to organize a huge international conference. The second thing is, and that is for all your knowledge, Romania, as Professor Marga says, was very strong in securitate, that means the secret police, but very weak in security. We need young people who want to make a career in security studies. By young, I mean, of course, PhD holders. Babeș Bolyai is recruiting also abroad and will be recruiting abroad. Or we need old people who want to go back and still spend a couple of years teaching, to share their experience and their knowledge. Please help us, because we are doing our best to help ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that was a most interesting perspective. And it's been noted, your request. We still have a few minutes to pose some questions to our main speakers tonight. And feel free, but try and be precise, concise. Yes, please.
I would like to ask Professor Marga a question. Your extensive, most comprehensive, and brilliant analysis is based off almost exclusively, if I'm not mistaken, Western literature, German, Italian, French, and so on. Is this because the problems you have dealt with, your preoccupation for analyzing the attitudes, relationship between Judaism and Christianism, is a problem which characterizes trends, mostly Catholic Church, but is not existing in the Oriental churches. And I mean mostly the Orthodox Church and the Greek. I mean the Orthodox Greek Church of Greece.
Thank you, Ambassador Almor, for this very important question. I took into consideration the Western literature because this literature is given the pattern for approaching. This was the reason of my option. But you are right. There are differences between the churches with regard to the development, to the rhythm of analysis devoted to the Judaic sources of Christianity, to the life of Jesus and other aspects. But as you know, we are a university which has in Europe the largest structure devoted to the to the Christian roots of Europe. And besides that, as my colleague Geman said, and Michael Shafir, we have also a program devoted to the Jewish roots. But we have the most complex theological structure in Europe as a university, operating in 4 faculties of theology, representing 7 historical churches of Transylvania. Based on our experience, I would say the following. First of all, as far as the doctrine is concerned, there are no big differences between the churches. But you are again right. I quoted mostly the Catholic and the Protestant analysis. First of all, the Protestants launched at the beginning of the 20th century the research of the so-called historical Jesu, with von Harnack, with Bultmann, and many, many others. Then the Catholics have assumed this topic, and they have developed till the recent monography of Karl Ratzinger, Jesus from Nazareth, which is based on this analysis, which is a situation in the Orthodox Church, in the Oriental Church, as you said. There are tendencies towards the same analysis, but of course the researches are not so developed like in the Catholic Church, like in the Protestant Church. We have also, for instance, in our faculty of Orthodox Theology, at least 4, I think, professors, docents who studied in Jerusalem, who are familiar with Judaism more than usual theologues in any Christian, in any church. I think there are also some doctoral theses devoted to the Jewish roots of Christianity. Anyway, I would say the following. The direction is the same, but the development is different. Again, I quoted the reference literature, I hope. The reference literature is the literature which gives a pattern for such an interpretation. But this is a case of the Romanian Orthodoxy. We have to accept. Romanian Orthodoxy has a special color. It's a Latin Orthodoxy. Such color made possible a visit of the Pope in Bucharest. Probably. I hope that Cardinal Ratzinger, as Pope, will go to Moscow, but we have to wait for such moment. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Professor, do you want to come here? Okay, go.
Professor Idel, if I understood you correctly, you said until there are no longer any states, there will not be absence of anti-Semitism. If that is a correct statement you made, what happens to Israel as a state?
It was Professor Gimmond, I think.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I thought it was you. You were the one that said that. You should be the one to answer.
My issue was that we have in Europe one single chance to eliminate sometime anti-Semitism. And this is the liberal, the humanitarian ideology based on the ideology of the roots of the Enlightenment. And of course, this is now the basis of the United Europe's ideal. Of course, it is a large gap between what happens in practice and which is the ideal of Europe. I am studying and teaching the European idea in its historical evolution. It was a generous idea. And it was, for instance, in the period of the Second World War, the resistance was one of the main resources for this idea of a united Europe after the war. That is why I believe strongly that united Europe is a way to eliminate sometime anti-Semitism. What concerns anti-Israelian policy sometimes in the European Union, I would not dare to say that this could be a long-standing and an official standpoint of the European Union. For the moment, we are very far from a united European attitude in external policy making. The Lisbon Treaty is a very little step forward, but it was not fulfilled the main aim, to have a common external policy. That is why the European countries for the moment are influenced by their internal conditions. In France is another situation, in Germany another situation, in Romania is another situation. And that is why for the moment, of course, we are very, very far from this ideal, but we have to have the ideal in front of us. This is my opinion.
Thank you. Can I then ask Idel the same question about Israel? If it is felt that the absence of states will stop anti-Semitism in the Middle East, do you see that as a future prospect?
I don't know if you remember, I was introduced as a scholar of Kabbalah. So you must accept my answer in a very qualified manner. Apparently, anti-Semitism doesn't disappear. We have mutations, transformations, unfortunately. I don't assume that that's a given. It must be. But looking backward to history, without attempting to create mythologies, for the time being, the reading is that we have differences in anti-Semitism. We don't have extraordinary increase. Unfortunately, we don't have great decrease. We have mutations from geographical areas, from one form of ethnical approach to other, meaning anti-Semitism now in the Arab world is anti-Semitic, which is almost a paradox. But nevertheless, we have such a mutation. I hope that's going to be the last one. That's a very, very optimistic opinion.
Yes, one last question. Do you want to stay there?
You might be able to eliminate anti-Semitism in Europe, but you are not taking...
You mean me personally? Or in general?
You are not taking into consideration the third power, the Islam in Europe. And you didn't even hint to its role to incite anti-Semitism in Europe, since there is big immigration by Muslims.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, okay. I will profit answering this question and other observations. Yes. Yes. With regard to the Islam, I share what I think one of the best historians of our age, Walter Laqueur in America, said about this problem. He mentioned the fact that Europe is in danger. It's in danger on the one side because of the very reduced natality. The indigenous Europeans are less and less as proportion, and also because of the unwilling, because of the refuse of the newcomers, mostly Muslims, to accept the integration into the European society. And of course, 3 days ago, the leader of Turkey gave a signal which is, according to I am for Turkey, I'm pro-Turkey, I would say, frankly. But his signal, he said, don't integrate, he appealed to the Turks, don't integrate in the respective societies. Of course, probably it's a rapid reaction to the discussions with some European leaders with regard to the integration of Turkey in the European Union. Again, I'm for the integration. But this is the situation. Of course, we can see some reluctances in the policy of some states in Europe to deal with the presence of Muslims. We see the reluctances in the case of France. In other countries, we see the same situation. I think you are right to make this hypothesis. The increased number of Muslims determines Europe to take different attitudes, which could be evaluated. But with regard to the anti-Semitism in Europe, I would come back on the very good observations made by Professor Wistrich with regard to the attitude of the Europeans now vis-à-vis of Israel, vis-à-vis of the Christianization of the continent. On the one side, in Europe, there is a tendency to reduce the weight of the Christianity in the theoretical debates. And when Pope came to Germany, Der Spiegel said he comes to an unchristianized country. It was not right, but it was a formula of Der Spiegel. Unchristlich gewordenes Land, das war der Ausdruck. But on the other side, there are new researches published in Vienna 4 years ago, in Cernik Verlag, about the situation of religiosity. And this analysis, based on polls made every 9 years, show that the tendency is toward a stronger religiosity among the people in Europe. Anyway, France has this paradoxical situation. On one side, less people are going to the church, but more than expected people are reivindicating themselves from an ecclesial community, from a religious community. Anyway, I think that religious turn is a fact. We have to accept this diagnosis. I think, of course, anti-Semitism was approached by my colleagues. I don't want to repeat what they said. I fully agree with them. But I think it's a success from our perspective. It's a very sure success to discuss with the people that Jesus was a Jew, that Jesus belonged to the Jewish people, that he was a part of the Jewish history. Such analyses are modifying the perspective. We have to accept this fact. And I think it's a very good step to discuss with the students, with new generations, and to spread such knowledge. Of course, it's not completely new. We have to accept the discussion within the intellectual circle. Intellectual elite is one. The distribution of the knowledge in the large categories of people, it's another topic. And it takes time. It's very, very clear. But again, to modify the perspective on Jesus, on Christianity, showing the Jewish roots, the Judaic sources, this is, I think, a very important fact in the evolution of new generation, evolution of Europe, in our evolution, we have to say. As far as relativism is concerned, I would defend the idea that a universal approach is needed. But of course, the problem, how to articulate such an approach. And Professor Wistrich rightly underlined the fact that relativism also produces a lot of prejudices to the Jewish people, a lot of negative histories or facts. Europe, we know it's enough complex, but and I know that we have to reach again what the French Episcopate said in the declaration in 65, when Episcopate said the situation of Israel is a part of the destiny of Christianity, in the sense that Christianity is responsible for the co-responsible for the situation of Israel. Israel is a part of the same world as the Christians. I think this point must be reached again. But we have in Europe now a kind of skepticism, a kind of reluctance to approach difficult questions. I said, the problem is to elaborate visions. This is, from the intellectual point of view, the problem. Professor Idel, as usual, is very cultivated. He brings a lot of things in the debate, but I think his view is complementary with what I said. Of course, it's important to see the differentiations between Judaism. We analyzed also in our seminars what Hayun said. Of course, Hayun is a journalist. But I would be very happy to see the students learning what Martin Buber said about Judaism. Comprehensive, enough for this age, of course. For other levels of studies, we need other monographies. But I think that we could detect some structures of Judaism which are strong, and to spread such structures, it's an important step in our culture. What you said, it's a very refined distinction within Judaism, which is important. I fully agree with you that critical ferment is due in the European culture to the Jewish thinking, and I belong also to the 68 generation, and we studied also School of Frankfurt. Yes, we know this topic, and I remember when you mentioned the critical contribution of Jews, what Habermas said in this building. The critical ferment was always in Germany, and Germany, Europe as a whole, due to the Jewish contributions. I think that you have to accept that the Judaism is present in general concept which we are operating in Europe. The sense of the life. We cannot separate the interpretation, being Christian, be Judaic, it doesn't matter in this regard. The sense of the life from the Jewish premises, from the Jewish approaches. And many, many other things are present in the European. With regard to, you are right, we have to learn Judaism for understanding Christianity, but also for understanding Judaism as such. I fully agree with you. But I would repeat what Hans Küng said to Pinhas Lapid in the debate in Stuttgart Radio. Please help us to understand better the Judaism as such, for understanding also Christianity and Judaism, both. This is answer given already by. You are right when you said the European look mostly to the interbellic situation. Yes, this is true. As a fact, I mentioned this anecdote due to Scholem for provoking this thinking based on history and opening it to the future. This was my provocation. But as usual, I would conclude I learned a lot from you participating in this meeting. Thank you very much.
Just, if I may add a couple of footnotes to these fascinating remarks. I mean, it's likely to go on forever, but I was reminded of the remark of the previous Pope, the Polish Pope, about how everything is lived under the sign of contradiction. And all these final observations, I feel they are true, and yet they are also true in a limited sense. It's yes and no. If we take the example of Europe, I share Professor Geermans, or I would like to share, very much like to believe, that a united Europe is going to be able to put behind it the dark legacy. And there are signs that would seem to confirm that, and ironically, they sometimes seem to come more from the eastern part of Europe than they do from the western part of Europe today. But I'm also aware of the fact that in the past, efforts to unify Europe have often had some horrific consequences, including in the 20th century. That doesn't mean that that determines the future. This is a different kind of unification, and yet experience teaches us some caution in that respect. When we talk about the critical Jews, I think, yes, Europe is very much prepared to take on board these, this minority within a minority. The marginalized critical Jews are probably living the most glorious period in history in terms of their reputation, of being admired, iconized, revered. All of them are welcome, and nearly all of them are anti-Israel. They may not be anti-Jewish, although many are, but anti-Israel almost to a man, which means that looked at from Jerusalem, it's at the very least ambiguous. That this cult of what Isaac Deutscher used to call the non-Jewish Jew, you call the critical, like maybe the postmodern Jew even in some ways, it looked at from here, it's very mixed, very mixed. And if that is the only kind of Jew that Europe, even today, a much more enlightened Europe can fully accept, then we see also some limits to how much Europe itself has evolved, because I absolutely agree with what you said about we would like to see Judaism accepted in its own right and not, as a means only to understanding the identity and the roots of Europe. The one last thought about anti-Semitism, I can't help but think about this question of whether we will ever see an end to anti-Semitism. Because, I mean, beyond the question of the Vidal Sassoon Center would have to dissolve itself and we would be out of business, as you understand, is not something that we would necessarily, everyone would look forward to. But seriously, I think that the historical record is clear. It is really most unlikely. Jewish tradition, as I understand it, but I stand to be corrected, leaves that prospect to the end of days. In other words, this could indeed be, when the days of the Messiah are near or are here, we may indeed live such a scenario. A witty but rather anti-Jewish Jew who created the Social Democratic Party of Austria-Hungary, Victor Adler, actually said in some bitterness at a major party conference at the end of the 19th century, he said, "Comrades, the last anti-Semite will disappear with the last Jew." And, looking at the record, I think that's very likely. The problem is, can we neutralize the anti-Semites? Can we basically render them ineffective? They'll always be there. But if Europe is moving more in that direction, if there is a good prospect for that, then, I would be very happy to settle for that solution as well. Because the anti-Semites are far more likely also to be opposed to the existence of Israel. I think that is, whether they're overt, covert, it doesn't matter. I think behind it all, we sense and we even know, I think, we know that is the case. So if we can arrive at that situation, and I think there's some prospect, some hope that we can do that, I think that we've progressed. What I would like to do simply now is to thank, first of all, Professor Marga for her outstanding presentation here, and I think it was a great privilege for us to have been able to cover so much ground thanks to his contribution. I'd like to thank Moshe Idel, as ever, for having, raised many provocative and stimulating thoughts. I'd like to thank our two guests, Professor Giamant and Professor Michael Shafir, and all those heroic people who have stayed here with us right to the bitter end and helped us to make this a productive evening. Thank you.